Okay, so the title of my presentation is Discrimination Against the Japanese. So then the first view graph is about LA in 1871. And that time, there was a Tong War, and the white man got caught, in the crossfire and got killed. So then 500 white men entered Nigger Alley, which is a part of Chinatown, to rob and kill. So every Chinese building was burned. And this is here, 18 Chinese were tortured and hung from gallows. Okay, so this is what happened in LA, Chinatown in 1871. Okay, so let me go to the next graph. Okay, now here's the Constitution for the state of California. And these are some of the words that were in the Constitution itself. In Section 2, no corporation shall employ directly or indirectly in any capacity any Chinese or Mongolian. Okay. And then Section 3 said no Chinese shall be employed on any state, county, municipal, or other public work except in punishment for crime. So you could see that, in 1880, when they wrote the Constitution, it was really discriminatory. Okay. And then, the Chinese came to the U.S. in 1848, gold rush. So thousands of Chinese came. And then in 1882, the government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act and said no more Chinese could come, okay, for the next 10 years. So on the table, you see the population of the Chinese in the U.S. So, it was growing every 10 years by about 30,000. And then after they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, you can see that the population stabilized and started going down. So then this is how the people in the US thought that they had solved the Chinese problem. Okay. And so then here I got this interesting demographics about the Chinese population. Okay. So I have here, the first column is the year, and the second column is the number of male Chinese, and then the third column is the number of female Chinese, and then fourth column is the ratio of male to female. So you can see, like in the year 1900, there were 78,000 male Chinese foreign-born, and then there were 2,000 something female foreign-born Chinese. So the ratio of male to female was 36-1. Okay. So you can see that the ratio was, heavily favored in terms of male than female in all these years. So that made, I think, not a natural community. Okay. And then here we have the citizenship for becoming a U.S. So when the country was first formed, they passed the Naturalization Act. And this is naturalization to immigrants who were free white persons of a good moral character. So right away, Blacks and Asians were excluded, okay? So Blacks and Asians were ineligible, aliens ineligible for citizenship. So that's how it was from the beginning of the country. And then after the Civil War, the Blacks became eligible. And in the year 1924, they made the Native American Indians become eligible for U.S. citizens. But still, many, Japanese could not become U.S. citizens. Immigrants could not become U.S. citizens. Okay. Now, the Chinese came to U.S. about 40 years before the Japanese, and then the Chinese were discriminated against. So the East safe at home. They're going to avoid the discrimination that the Chinese face. So you say, so, oh, we're going to wear Western clothes, have Western haircut, and have children, attend the school and get good grades and stuff like that. And the main thing was China was not as strong militarily as Japan. So Issei thought that Japan could support them. But anyway, these are the people that were, quote, anti-Japanese. So these were, like the native sons and daughters of the Golden West, or the American Legion, or the California State Federation of Labor. So these are, all the organizations that were against the Japanese people, and also the newspapers like the San Francisco Examiner and San Francisco Chronicle. They were, anti-Japanese. Okay, so in the newspaper, San Francisco Chronicle, February 1906, these are some of the articles that they had in the newspaper. And one article is, crime and poverty go hand in hand with Asiatic labor. And then here's another one that they emphasize quite a bit. Japanese menace to American women. So they kept on emphasizing that Issei men were a threat to American women or white women. And they also had things like brown men and evil in the public schools, the yellow peril, how Japanese crowd out the white race. So these are some of the articles that were in the newspaper at the turn of the century. Okay. So then here's the number of people that came to Japan. From 1869 to 1924, 275,000 Japanese came to the US. Okay, so you could compare that with the Italians. In 1 year, 283,000 Italians entered the US. So more Italians came in 1 year than Japanese came in 55 years. So the percentage of the Japanese in the US population was very small. So you could see the statistics on the bottom. It was 0.03% of the US population. Okay. Now, there were a lot of Japanese that were in Hawaii. They were working on the sugarcane plantation and the pineapple plantation. So what the Hawaii plantation owners used to do is they should send recruiters to Japan to get the Japanese people to sign up, and they sign up for a 3-year contract to work on a plantation. Okay, so then these 3-year contracts were considered to be indentured servitude. So when Hawaii became a territory of the U.S. in 1898, these contracts were null and valid. So invalid. So then what happened was thousands of Issei left Hawaii, left the plantation, and many, 40,000 came to California. Okay. So at the turn of the century, 40,000 Japanese showed up in California, and that's what alarmed the racists. Okay. So here's a picture of a segregated school. Now the California law allowed segregated school. Okay. And then, so then 100 years ago, there were segregated schools in towns around Sacramento. And down here in Southern California, El Monte had a separate school for Japanese, K to 6. So we had segregated school for Japanese school children in California. Okay. So here's an interesting thing that happened after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So when the earthquake happened, then a lot of buildings were destroyed in Chinatown. So then the Chinese families moved out. So then they had the Chinese school in Chinatown, And now all the students, a lot of the students moved out. So in 1906, San Francisco Board of Education ordered the Japanese children to attend the Chinese school. Okay. Meanwhile, the Japanese were spread out throughout San Francisco, so the children were attending, many different schools. But now the children were ordered to attend the public school in Chinatown. And that upset the Issei parents, okay? This is what Teddy Roosevelt negotiated with Japan, okay? So then to reduce the number of Japanese coming to the U.S., only two groups of Japanese could come. And Issei living in Japan, who once lived in the U.S., and then parents, wife, and children of Issei living in the U.S. Okay, so those are the only people that could come to the U.S. So then this is the way it worked out in my family. My grandfather, Kitaro Tatsui, lived in the U.S. a long time ago. And then, I think at the turn of the last century, then he was living back in Japan. But he had lots of sons. And whenever he wanted a son to go from Japan to the U.S., my grandfather, Kitara, would first come to the U.S. and then that's part A. Issei living in Japan, who once lived in the U.S. And then part B, once he got to the U.S., then he would call his son over. And that was part B. So that's how my father and his brothers came to the U.S. So they used part A and part B. Okay. So anyway, after the gentleman's agreement, the number of immigrants from Japan to the U.S. decreased. So then, you can see what happened in the year 1907, 1908, 1909, how the immigrant population decreased. Okay. So then, let me get to the next view graph. Okay, let me just make sure I got the right one. Yeah. Okay, so then part 3 was that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to show the rest of the world how strong the U.S. was. So he had 16 battleships painted white, and they sailed all the way around the world. But this is how the government, reacted to what happened in San Francisco. Okay, and then now we have the picture bride, and then at the turn of the century, there were at 1900 census, there were 410 females and 23,000 Japanese males. Okay, and then California had the anti-miscegenation law, so the Issei men could not get married to white women, and no immigration from Japan. So we had the solution, which was the picture bride. And the picture bride is called Shashin Kekkon. Okay, so then this occurred between the years 1907 and 1920. So a guy in the US would send a photo to his mother or matchmaker in Japan, and then his mother or the matchmaker would try to find a young girl that would move to California. So then these are the picture brides, and 25,000 picture brides came to the mainland and Hawaii. Okay, so you can see, this was one way of getting on the gentleman's agreement. But in the year 1920, the Japanese stopped this practice. But anyway, the picture brides, thousands came, 25,000, and they started the families that we have in the U.S. So the picture bride was an important part of the history of the Japanese American. Okay, so here we have a photograph of Angel Island, which was in San Francisco Bay. And on the right, we have photos of picture brides that just came. Okay. And then, the Chinese had picture brides too, and they had to stay months at Angel Island, while the East Bay picture brides had to spend weeks at the Angel Island. Well, in New York Harbor at Ellis Island, people would just spend only hours, and I don't think anybody stayed overnight at Ellis Island in New York Harbor. So you can see the difference between Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in San Francisco. Angel Island was trying to keep the Japanese and Chinese people out of the country, while Ellis Island, New York, was for the Europeans to be accepted, welcomed into the U.S. Okay. So in 1909, the California legislature passed, many anti-Japanese bills. And that time, the president of the U.S. was Teddy Roosevelt, and he would always call up the governor of California to say, "Stop that bill, veto that bill." So none of the bills became law. But Teddy Roosevelt, was an aggressive president that would, tell governors what to do. Okay. So now we come to the famous 1913 Alien Land Law. And the 1913 Alien Land Law prevented or prohibited the Issei from buying farmland and signing leases longer than 3 years. Okay. So this 1913 is the alien land law, so applies to Isseis. But it did not apply to the Niseis, their children, because the Niseis were U.S. citizens. So then the Isseis could buy farmland using the name of their children. Okay. And here's the guy that co-authored the 1913 Alien Land Law, and he says the purpose of the land law was to cause pain and suffering, so that the Issei heir would return to Japan and no more Japanese would come. Okay, so that's why they had the 1913 Alien Land Law, to cause pain and suffering. Okay, so then these are the people that were affected by the Alien Land Law. And there were 73 Japanese, 2 Chinese, 1 Hindu, and 0 Korean. Okay, so these were the ones, the people that were affected by the state attorney general. Okay, so here we have Earl Warren, who was attorney general for the state of California. Just before World War II, he was the governor of California during the war, and then later on he was the Supreme Court Justice of the U.S. Okay, but here's what he said in 1943. We don't propose to have the Japs back in California. But this is when the Japanese were in concentration camps, and this is what he said. Okay, so then in 1945, he had started cases against 4 Isseis, and 2 settled for $100,000 and $25,000. Okay, but anyway, even 1946, after the end of the war, the Attorney General was trying to take land away from the Isseis. Okay, so there's this interesting case. So there's this guy named Takao Ozawa, and then he decided to have a test case to see this about becoming a citizen. And he says the 1906 Naturalization Act allowed whites and Africans to be naturalized. Okay, so whites and Africans become naturalized, but the Japanese could not. So then Takao Ozawa decided to say, my skin is white. Okay, so he went to the Supreme, he went to court, and then his case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Takao Ozawa claimed that his skin was white, but U.S. in 1922, the U.S. Supreme Court said only Caucasians were white. Okay, now Caucasians were race of people that came from northern India, in the Middle East. Okay, so this guy here, Bhaghat Singh, he's an Indian Sikh, was Aryan, and he was therefore Caucasian, so he got a citizenship. Okay, so then this Indian from the northern part of India got U.S. Citizenship. But in 1933, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that all whites were Caucasians, but not all Caucasians were white. So they took away his citizenship. Okay, so then this is interesting law. Okay, so in the past, the woman's citizenship was that of the husband. Okay, and in the past, somebody on the door. Yeah, in the past, that woman citizenship did not mean that much, because in the past, a long time ago, women did not own property. Okay, so then it didn't matter, if they were citizens or not. But then, beginning of the last century, we had the suffrage movement, and then the women, they said they want to be. The women, the suffrage movement said they want to be able to vote, and also citizenship. And the citizenship was to be independent of husbands. Okay. So here is the situation. So in 1922, we had the Cable Act, and the Cable Act said that if a woman married a foreigner, her citizenship not affected, except a white or Nisei woman marries an Issei, she loses U.S. citizenship. Okay, so you see what happened? So that if a Nisei woman married an Issei man in 1922, after the 1922 Cable Act, she loses U.S. citizenship. Okay, now the second part is, if a white woman's marriage ends, she regains U.S. citizenship. If Nisei woman marriage ends, she still lost U.S. citizenship and cannot become U.S. citizen because she is from an ineligible race. Okay, so that's how the Nisei woman could lose her U.S. citizenship, by marrying an Issei. Okay, so this is the Cable Act. Okay, so then in 1924, the U.S. Congress passed the Immigration Act. And the act brought immigration to aliens ineligible to citizenship. Okay, so now the people from Japan could not become U.S. could not become U.S. citizen. So therefore, the people of Japan could not immigrate to the U.S. Okay, so this was the way that the government decided to solve the, quote, Japanese problem. Okay, so here we have the ethnic population on the mainland. Okay, so you see how 1920 to 1930 it grew, but after 1930 in 1940, went down. So the Issei population went down and Nisei population went up. But the net result was that from 1930 to 1940, the total Japanese population went down. Okay. So anyway, when this 1924 Immigration Act was passed, it was called the National Day of Humiliation, Kokujo Kubi. Okay, so then the reaction in Japan was bitter and angry. Okay, so anyway, people from Japan thought they were better than the people from China, but then they found out that they were the same. That they were a problem to the U.S. government. Okay, so here we have discrimination in schools. So we have Major John Iso. Okay, so in 1923, he was a student at the County Junior High School in Hollywood, and he was elected student body president, but the parents complained, so school abolished student government. And in 1926, he won a high school oratorical contest on U.S. Constitution, but he was forced to withdraw from state finals, and his job was to coach the second place winner. Okay, so we had the discrimination in the public schools. And then we had the miscegenation law. Okay, so in 1880, California had a law that says illegal for white persons to marry Negro, mulatto, or Mongolian. And then in 1909, persons of Japanese descent were added to the list of undesirable marriage partners of white California in the state. Okay. And then 1945, California had the law prohibited marriage between whites, Negroes, mulatto, Mongolians, and Malays. Okay, so you can see that in the state of California, it was illegal for the Japanese to get married to a white person. So then the law was on the books until 1948. So then in 1948, the state of California permitted Japanese to get married to white people. Now, the Japanese people, they had difficulty getting into the regular hospital. So the Japanese solved this problem by building their own hospital. Okay. So then this is the Japanese hospital in Boyle Heights. Okay, so it opened its door in 1929. Now I think, but in beginning of World War II, I think Japanese people could go to the regular hospital. So here we have the Japanese children's home, which was an orphanage, and a lot of families, maybe the mother died, so then the father had the children. So the father had to work. So what he would do is he would bring his children to the Shonin orphanage, and they would take care of him, take care of the children. And then the father would come on Sunday to take the children off for, ride to the beach and stuff like that. But, Shonin was a, community service for children, because a lot of the regular community service did not accept Japanese people. Okay. Oh yeah, so then in the 1930s, before World War II, the Nisei young people, Nisei that, went to high school or you went to college and graduated, it was hard to find jobs, okay? And then, so then jobs they could find were usually in the Japanese community, so you had to work in Tokyo or something like that, okay? So then the Essays thought that the reason they could not get good jobs was that, they were foreigners and they didn't speak good English. And the Essays thought that their children, since they were born in the U.S., went to U.S. high school and college, that they could find good jobs. But no, in the 1920s, 1930s, the Niseis also could not find a good job. And then now there was housing discrimination, so that 80% of the city of Los Angeles was off limits to the Japanese people. Okay, so the Japanese people lived in restricted areas like Little Tokyo, and then what we did was we lived in a restricted area called Uptown. So Uptown was Olympic Boulevard and Vermont Avenue. So it was part of Los Angeles on the west side, near west side. And it was, a Japanese ghetto. So you could see the house that I lived in, and the house that I lived in was on Dewey Avenue. And I think, north of our house was 100% non-Japanese, and south of our house was 100% Japanese. So I knew all the families that lived south of where we lived because they were all Japanese, and I used to play with them. But I didn't know anybody that lived north of our house, because it was a non-Japanese. But this was how it was before the war. So everybody knows about World War II, that 110,000 people were put in concentration camps. But only a few thousand German and Italians were put into camp, even though those were enemy aliens. Okay. So here we have swimming pool discrimination. So then the way that a lot of swimming pool worked is, they would not, this is before the war or right after the war, they would not allow the Nisei children to go in the swimming pool until the day before they're going to empty the pool. Okay. So the day before they get empty the pool, they let the Nisei children go swimming. So that's what happened. So then there used to be even discrimination in bowling. But, a long time ago, they ended the discrimination in bowling. Before, the Niseis could not, bowl in the regular tournament and things like that. And then there was discrimination in the military. So the Japanese not accepted into the Navy or Air. This is World War II. So they will not be accepted into the Navy or Air Force. But the Niseis were inducted into the Army. So when you're in the Army, it was either the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, which was the translators and interpreters between Japanese and English, or you joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit. And the thing is that the 442nd was a segregated unit with only Japanese American, and 442nd was a combat unit. See, in the U.S. Army, there's lots of people in the U.S. Army, but only about maybe 10% of the U.S. Army has are the fighting people. Okay, most of the U.S. Army, people are in the back taking care of the trucks or supply line or whatever, but only 10% or so of the U.S. Army soldiers are in the front line to fight. But if you're Japanese, then you're sent to the 442nd, and that was a combat unit. So then all the Japanese had to fight. Okay, so then that's what happened during the war. And then now here we have President Clinton giving the Congressional Medal of Honor to Senator Daniel Inouye. Okay, so what happened was that during the war, only one Nisei soldier got the Medal of Honor during World War II. And everybody saying, gee, that's, there were so many brave Niseis out there, and only one Medal of Honor seemed so low. So they were saying that for, during the war and after the war. So when Bill Clinton was president, he formed a commission to look into this matter. And the commission said that 20 Niseis to be awarded the Medal of Honor. So then, many years after the end of the war, they awarded the Medal of Honor to these Niseis. Oh yeah, so here's discrimination in cemeteries. So here's photographs of Evergreen Cemetery, which is in Los Angeles, just a few miles east of Tokyo. Okay, so I think many of you know about Evergreen Cemetery, but the Japanese could not get buried in most cemeteries in Los Angeles, but the Japanese could get buried in Evergreen Cemetery. And that's where all the Japanese used to get buried. Okay. So anyway, I just want to say that for the first half of the 20th century, the racists wanted to send the Japanese back across the Pacific Ocean to Japan. And then after Pearl Harbor, they wanted to send the Japanese over the mountain to the deserts. Yeah. So then the 50 years of discrimination against the Issei culminated in their incarceration and concentration camp during World War II. And after the war, the discrimination against the Japanese lessened, and there is now no overt discrimination. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation.